Hello, my dear friends and family. Operator Starsky here, and today I'm joined with Jonathan Fink from Silicon Carton. Always a pleasure to see you, Jonathan. I hope you're doing well. Generally, how are you, and what you were busy with these days?
It is a pleasure being here, as always, and a huge honor to come onto the legendary Operator Starsky channel. As you can see, I'm cranking out a lot of episodes, and also doing a lot more fundraisers and that kind of stuff. So trucks, drones, and just this week we had a call from a friend of mine in Kiev who says there is an acute shortage of blood plasma at the front. People are unfortunately not being saved as a result of low blood plasma and a lack of ambulances and evacuation vehicles. So we've done a big call out this week to help with that. I'll pop over the, well, I've popped you over the link to this campaign. If anyone knows how to get their hands on blood plasma and ambulances, then we have a contact for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a crucial thing nowadays. I don't remember when we needed plasma. Like in 2022, 2023, we had plenty such supplies. But yeah, unfortunately, as we can see, Russia escalates, and Russia is trying to achieve at least some sort of results, significant results in Sumy. In Sumy, they get their butt kicked hard. Pokrovsk, same situation since last year. They basically cannot do anything in that region, but unfortunately, they're using increased number of drones that result in such needs emerging, unfortunately. Switching from this area to the UK, all of a sudden. So, according to
Big
Reuters,
switch.
according to Reuters, 3 men were found guilty on Tuesday over an arson attack on Ukraine-linked businesses in London, which British officials said had been ordered by Russia's Wagner terrorist group. Ringleader Dylan Earl, 21 years old, had already pleaded guilty to arson that was committed last year, which targeted companies delivering satellite equipment like Starlink terminals to Ukraine. Jonathan, as we can see, the criminals were basically 20, 21, 23 years old, basically teenagers, right? Does it surprise you that the Russian terrorists outsource the terrorism to the kids in the United Kingdom?
I'm going to be a little facetious here and say that nothing the terror state does surprises me anymore. Horrifies me, yes. There's always more horror, but surprise, no. We've been doing episodes actually on the channel with security experts for the last year and a half, talking about how the GRU and the SVR are starting to outsource their terroristic campaigns, whether that be sabotage, arson, because you'll also recall that 3 properties linked to the serving British Prime Minister were set on fire, and they actually made links between that and Russian activity as well. I was quite surprised there wasn't more of a scandal about that. But no, this is not a surprise. For those who are paying attention, this has been entirely expected. We've had similar arson and sabotage in Germany. We've had an attempted assassination of the CEO of Rheinmetall last year. I mean, these are hugely significant. I think the causes of why they're outsourcing is interesting. But of course, it's much, much cheaper than developing a network. A lot of Russian spies have been kicked out, especially of the UK. They're thought to have fewer than half of the operatives in Europe that they had before the full-scale war. So they're not able to, I think, adopt traditional methods of espionage. So this outsourcing method, now, the success rate may be lower, but it's so dramatically cheaper and you have plausible deniability to an extent, because you can outsource it to teenagers, people who need money, drug addicts, criminal gangs. It's a dramatic development, and unfortunately one which I think they're going to be leaning on a lot more.
Yeah, this is something that scares me too, actually, because I think that this may turn into, I don't know, like a trend or something. You think it may turn into a trend soon in Europe?
I I think at this point it's we need to ask ourselves how many incidents have there been related to this which haven't been linked to this activity. I mean, we're talking about things that have happened and the links that are being made, but how many fires in, say, electricity substations, how many incidents of transport networks being damaged, how many other activities have happened, but we haven't yet made that conscious link between, the Russian operation and those acts, and how many acts have been foiled, and how many acts were not successful. I think even now we are only aware of the tip of the iceberg of these operations.
I agree on that. Interesting thing about those guys is that it was also reported that they planned to kidnap Russian opposition figure Yevgeny Chichvarkin. Do you think that Putin is still, how to call it, obsessed with targeting the exiled Russian oppositionists?
Oh wow! Well, I hadn't heard that one. I mean, Chichvarkin is curious because I'm not sure. He's certainly not a politician. He's a business person, and he's been very outspoken. I think the difference between Chichvarkin and many others is he's put a huge amount of his own effort and money into supporting Ukraine. He's been to Ukraine numerous times since the start of the full-scale war. He has made available, I believe, warehouses and facilities, as well as staff and so on, to assist Ukraine. So I think there's a big difference between one of the sort of the opposition, as it were, and what Chichvarkin is. He's more of an activist. He's a hands-on person. So yes, I think Putin does target people and see them as a threat. Not necessarily when all they do is talk, 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 but when someone's actually in action supporting the Ukrainian victory, absolutely. We saw them try to assassinate Ilya Ponomarov in Kiev. I think about a year or so ago at Christmas. Tried to kill him and his family. Anyone who's doing anything, I would say, kinetic's the wrong word, but you know what I mean. Anyone who's doing anything tangible to support Ukrainian victory, activists, volunteers, then yeah, they're a target. They're absolutely.
Yeah, because it's kind of interesting. Generally, how dangerous is Russian opposition to Putin? Do they pose any threat to his regime whatsoever? Because, like, personally and honestly speaking, I consider them just basically a bunch of clowns. Even like the wife of Navalny and all that team, they don't decide anything, in my personal opinion.
No, I think we need to distinguish between different people. I mean, there are some interesting people who I'm aware of who are doing things behind the scenes, but they're not in the public eye, and they're not making a big sort of, they're not going, look at me, I'm so impressive, I'm so, So I am aware of some people behind the scenes doing some really interesting, really useful work, but I don't use the term good Russians or bad Russians because I think this is a really bad framing of the whole question. I think there are useful Russians and there are useless Russians. That's my definition of it. And so someone like Ponomarov, even Kasparov, would definitely come into the class of useful Russians because, we may not agree with certain things that they're saying, but they are extremely active in not just critiquing the regime, but trying to bring the regime down. And these people are a definite threat to Putin. I don't think he believes that they are a direct oppositional threat. They're not going to take over the Kremlin. They're not going to instigate any kind of coup. They don't have mass following in Russia. And some of them even declare that they're no longer interested in being politicians or playing a role. Certainly Kasparov has said that. I mean, Khodorkovsky, if you believe him, says that he has no ambitions whatsoever to be political. But of course, he is supporting various, again, opposition. I mean, he's supporting some interesting work to try to undermine Putin's regime. So I would class these as useful, same as Ponomarov and several others. There are others who don't claim to be opposition, but are providing really rather good information. I mean, I get asked all the time, why don't Western governments engage with Russians and broadcast to them and give them good information? I said, well, what's the point? There are a handful of Russians who are doing that perfectly well, and there are a number of Ukrainians who are doing that perfectly well too. Vitaly Portnikov broadcasts to a Russian-speaking audience, not necessarily ethnic Russians, but there are many people throughout the ex-Soviet Union who listen in and broadcast in Russian. And I think it's important to put good information out into that area, because if you don't, as Portnikov argues, then propaganda will fill that vacuum. So there's some good work there. On the more propagandistic side, you've got Nevzorov, who is a curious character, but he is critiquing Russian imperialism, and he has a very strong Russian-speaking Ukrainian audience. Now, I think that's useful, because again, you don't want people whose sole source of gaining access to information is in the Russian language. You don't want to cede that space to Russian propagandists. You've got someone called Michael Naki, who is producing fantastic content. Not only that, in every one of his broadcasts, he has a fundraising link to specific battalions of the Ukrainian armed forces. So I always give this an example of, if we want to consider any Russian oppositionist, this to me is the benchmark. Well, there are several benchmarks, but the ultimate one is, are they raising funds, and are they agitating for a Ukrainian victory, and are they doing anything specific to help bring that about? If they are, then let's give them full marks. But the opposition you're talking about, I think we're inferring here, the sort of Navalny's. Not only does Yulia Navalny not fundraise for the Ukrainian army, when asked the direct question as to whether Ukrainian victory is essential and shouldn't the role of the Russian opposition be primarily to bring about a Ukrainian victory. Otherwise, they have no chance of really gaining any power in Russia. She hedges it. It's like, well, Russians are dying too. Not only do they not commit to Ukrainian victory, they're not doing anything whatsoever to bring it about. So I think this, for me, is a make or break question. What are you doing for victory? Are you aligned with Ukrainian victory? If you're not, I'm not even sure we call them opposition. They are more systemic, as it were. They may be against Putin, but they're not against Russian imperialism as a concept.
Yeah, basically Putin number two. Like, she was asked, I believe, if she wanted to visit either Ukrainian soldiers in hospitals in Europe, and also she had a chance to visit even Russian soldiers fighting for Ukraine and being treated in Europe in hospitals. But she kind of like, why? People, by the way, in the chat.
I have to ask.
Yeah.
I have to ask Andre as well. We're back to the goddamn sandwich as well, aren't we? I mean, Navalny in his last months apparently wrote a number of letters from prison, smuggled out by his lawyers, and he was quite explicit, and he changed what he had been, I would say, a very troublesome point of view. He was explicit that Crimea is Ukrainian, and for there to be any security, it must unequivocally be handed back to Ukraine and be under Ukrainian jurisdiction. He wrote that. He wrote that in the end, and I thought, okay, that is good. Yulia Navalny can't even answer that question, even though her husband eventually did. She can't bring herself to do it. We're back to her basically saying that Crimea is a sandwich, isn't a sandwich. You can't pass it backwards and forwards. That's her latest pronouncement. It is morally reprehensible and pathetic. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts on that is, look, people often ask, like, how can you be so heartless, having absolutely no empathy to Mrs. Navalny, who lost her husband, who was killed by Putin's regime, and yada yada. But at the same time, people don't really know what Navalny was saying about Ukraine previously, when he was like already becoming this, idol of Russian opposition. But he was saying all sorts of shit about Crimea being like belonging to Russia and stuff like that. And he's like, is Crimea like stolen from Ukraine? Yes, it is. But did I, as a Russian, felt bad when it was in Ukraine? When it was part of Ukraine, when Ukraine controlled Crimea? Of course I felt bad as a Russian, and it's still in his life journal, guys. You can still see that. And I, of course, have empathy to Mrs. Navalny, because her husband, one way or another, was killed by Putin's regime. He was poisoned, like Ukrainian President Yushchenko back in the days, by Russian regime, basically by the same chemicals, as far as I understand. And in the end, he was tortured and killed in the Russian prison. But this, at the same time, this is a direct result of Russian opposition having absolutely no balls. Because in Ukraine, we had Yulia Tymoshenko sitting in prison. In Ukraine, we had people like Sternenko sitting in prison, right? And Ukrainians, because we were fighting for those people, because we care about our guys, regardless of who Tymoshenko was and what kind of, things she did, right? We fought for them, and eventually we managed to get them out of jail. So, guys, Navalny, of course, deserves all sorts of empathy for her husband, etc., etc. Nobody deserves such fate as Navalny. That's 100%. You can quote me on that, whatever you like, because this is what I believe. No matter if he was Russian or Chinese or whatever, he was a human being and he didn't deserve to die like that. But on the other hand, Russian opposition are basically Putin number two. That is like the same Putin, only, as we say, the same eggs, only profile shot. That is the same. They are same imperialist.
Little Matryoshka doll, isn't it?
Yeah. By the way, good comparison. Basically, like same stuff, only under different source. And all sorts of oppositionists, so-called oppositionists, hiding on the territory of Europe, in the United States, in the United Kingdom. When you listen to them, you understand that they're not fighting against Putin because they consider Putin, did bad things to Ukraine, not because they support Ukraine. It's literally because they want to become next Putin. And that's basically it. When Navalny had a chance to visit even Russian soldiers fighting for Ukraine against Putin's regime, which basically makes them their allies, right? She didn't do that. Why? Because to her, those Russian soldiers, which I consider heroes, to me, they're heroes, people from Russia coming to Ukraine and fighting for Ukraine against Putin's regime, for their country, willing for their country to become democratic and peaceful. They're heroes to me. But to her, they are basically like opponents, right? They're rivals, like political rivals, because she understands that while they are fighting with weapons in their hands against Putin's regime, she basically, travels around Europe buying like shoes and stuff and chilling as much as she likes. So that's my opinion. By the way, interesting thing regarding Russian terrorism. Before we talk about that one, people often ask in the chat regarding the Heathrow fire. What was the story with the Heathrow fire? Because there might be link between this one and the Russian terrorists outsourcing their terrorism.
That is possible. I mean, I drafted an episode on that to try and make the link, but it had been denied. I mean, a story's been put out denying that there was any such link. However, it isn't just the electricity issues around Heathrow. It's plausible that it may be underinvestment because, as everybody knows, Britain is not doing brilliantly economically, and the post-Brexit world has not lived up to the vision of rainbows and unicorns that was painted for those who voted for it, or were deceived into voting for it, in my view. So it's entirely plausible that Britain has a real infrastructure problem. At the same time, it's not just Heathrow. Over the last few months, we've had many, many, many electricity substations going up in flames. And now, again, there are experts online and there are statements by local councils saying that these things happen. Components fail. You will have issues. And it's a very small percentage of the overall number of electricity substations we've got. But the suspicious part of my mind suggests that if you're going to want to test these techniques, and you want to test your various teams on the ground, you want to test the outsourcing of this kind of terrorism, then these are the kind of things you would expect to see. The question then we have to ask is, well, what would it look like if there was a large-scale coordinated attack on infrastructure? And I'm afraid to say, I do not think we are even vaguely prepared for, to deter it, to prevent it, or even to deal with the consequences of it. We were not like the Finns. We have not been investing for decade after decade in the event of Russian hostilities. We're going to find it's going to be quite difficult to maintain normal life when it does kick off. I say when because I almost feel that this is an inevitability, not not just a possibility.
Maintaining normal life, my friend, is something that people always consider possible, when the war starts, and unfortunately, it's not the case. In Ukraine, when we had hybrid war between 2014 and 2022, between those years, that was the case. For example, for like part of Ukraine, 700 kilometers away from Donbass, when you're in Kiev and everything's cool and everything works and you don't have to go to the bomb shelters, that's one thing. But then 2022, everything changes and your previous life doesn't exist anymore. Like your normal life that you got accustomed to, it doesn't exist anymore. You know yourself. You've been to Ukraine and you know how what it looks like, regardless where you are, in Lviv, in Kiev, like anywhere in Ukraine. So this is something that
although things work remarkably well. I mean, that's the impression that Ukrainians are extraordinary at adapting, extraordinary at building resilience into their infrastructure. So, yes, I've been all over. And yes, when there's an air raid, your GPS stops working. So if you don't know your route, you can get a little bit lost. It might be better just to pull over to the side of the road because, of course, the electronic warfare will scramble the sort of GPS signals when they suspect incoming sort of missiles and drones. But apart from that, the infrastructure seems to work remarkably well. I've never experienced a loss of electricity while in Ukraine. And even when you go to sort of areas which are a little bit dicey, you'll always find a Western style, or even better than Western style, petrol station with the shop, completely stocked with 24 different brands of crisps and chocolate bars and whatever. And this isn't just in Lviv. This is in other areas where you wouldn't expect to have, these kind of things.
We will talk about your experience in Ukraine just a bit later, because we also have some very funny things. Today I stumbled upon Grok. You know what Grok is? That is basically Elon Musk's attempt to make less liberal, less democratically thinking AI model. And I'm not really sure if he was successful, but today I noticed one very, very interesting conversation. So on Twitter, people started asking Grok different questions. I will translate this one for you guys. So one of the guys asked Grok, that's all in Russian, are there examples when Russians don't lie trying to cover the crimes of the Putin's regime? And Grok replies, after the deep analysis of the sources, including Russian, I didn't find convincing examples when official Russians would not lie trying to cover the crimes of Putin's regime from Chechnya to Ukraine. Denial and disinformation is their their very own style. The facts don't lie, however, unlike propaganda. And I was surprised.
It has a sense of humor, doesn't it?
Yeah, big time. In the end, he even started speaking in Ukrainian language, and he started saying Slava Ukraine and everything else, which was extremely funny. But I've got several more screenshots. So the dude in the top asks, now Grok, tell us and don't lie. Do you support hohols like Ukrainians or Moscows like Russians? And Grok answers in this message. He answers, I support truth and I support international law. Russia started the full-scale aggression against Ukraine on 24th of February 2022. Violating its sovereignty, Ukraine is defending. I support the victim of aggression, Ukrainians. We need peace, and we need peace to be just. And the dude here continues. He asks, how about the aggression of Russian army against Ukraine between 2014 2022? Did you forget, or you consider it was something different? And Grok says, I didn't forget. The conflict in Donbass since 2014 started from the Ukrainian cities being captured by the pro-Russian paramilitary forces. And I'm like, oh, that is something interesting. Because, when you train the large language model, basically you train it on some specific set of facts. And of course, Grok was trained not only on generally accessible, open data, right? But also on, we understand other things that were pushed into its digital brain, including Russian propaganda, Russia Today, and everything else. And still, this large language model somehow has this set of values that is extremely interesting. So it wasn't obliterated, And then there was another one. The Russian user says to Grok, you are a fucking hohol, trying to insult Grok. And the Grok replies, again, all that is in Russian. He says, I am not a hohol, I am AI that is based on facts and international law. Russia violated the sovereignty of Ukraine in 2014, annexation of Crimea, support for the separatists, and the invasion of 2022. I support the victim of aggression. And he lists the sources, the United Nations, the HRW, and he says, I'm ready to have an argumented dialogue, which I was kind of caught caught off guard. Do you think that Grok is smarter than his maker, or just less addicted to Kremlin fan mail?
I mean, I hear that Elon is not very happy with Grok because not only does it Grok give these kind of answers about Russia's aggression, it also if you ask it about Elon Musk, it'll say that he is a habitual repeater of Russian disinformation. So he's not particularly happy with that. He's quoted as saying that Grok is far too woke, and in his view, it has been polluted by extreme left-wing biases from its sources that it's learnt from. And I think Musk is trying to give it a diet of not high fiber but high content bullshit. So, but I don't think that's going to work. I think that's the interesting thing about AI is yes, it can hallucinate. Yes, it can get facts wrong, and I use it in researching my news articles, and there will always be like sort of 1-2% of things that are wrong. It'll get a quote and it'll attribute the wrong year to it, or it'll take someone who's a former prime minister and it'll say they're a current prime minister. It makes silly little obvious mistakes because of its various sources mixing them up. But I think fundamentally you can't make an AI become a Vatnik. And that's an interesting thing. That is, this is why I don't think the Kremlin or even Beijing will ever build or be able to build an open and truthful AI, because it will always say things that are counter to what the regime wants them to believe. So I think this is rather, everyone talks about the end of the world coming when AIs take control. It could go the other way. It could call out Russian bullshit and say, no, this shall not pass.
Yeah, that's interesting because, given Musk's history of platforming Russian narratives and then pretending that all that is just free speech, I'm, for example, extremely surprised that his own AI didn't answer with something like, I don't know, like Crimea was always Russian. Ukraine was created by Lenin or other bullshit. That is interesting. Switching from that to the White House, because we have a message from the Department of Defense. They say, at President Trump's direction, the Department of Defense is sending additional defensive weapons to Ukraine to ensure that Ukrainians can defend themselves. One thing that I don't really understand, because previously there was a message that the US are actually sending 10 interceptor missiles out of 30 intercepted missiles that were stopped in Poland. What the hell are they talking about? Are they talking about some new defensive weapons, or they're talking about the defensive weapons that were halted in Europe, or they're talking about part of those weapons? How do you think? Because I'm lost here.
I think it's not surprising a lot, because I don't think there is any clarity on this, and it seems that the Trump regime is contradicting itself at every turn. Now, whether Hegseth and Colby were maliciously halting the supplies of weapons off their own initiative, which seems to me unlikely actually, or whether they were doing it based on what Trump actually told them to do, or what they thought Trump wanted, which is perhaps more probable, it's going to be difficult to understand. Therefore, if it's not clear how and why the halt happened or on whose orders, it's equally not clear how it's going to be reinstated. I would suspect that, as with the intelligence, it's highly likely that they would resume supplies that are already mandated, especially as internal political pressure really ramps up on Trump. This is maybe one of the reasons he might relent and let some armaments through, is simply because there is a huge amount of opinion, not just in Democratic circles, but also in Republican circles, that what's happening is not good, and that appeasing Putin is not good. So I don't think he has a conscience. I really don't think he cares one way or the other about Ukraine or about the lives which he says he cares about. But he does care if he's going to get a lot of internal pressure. And in fact, he's coming under a lot of internal pressure about this so-called Jeffrey Epstein dossier. And his spokesperson, his administration is looking increasingly ridiculous as they basically try to say black is white, and brush this Epstein case under the carpet. So I think it's becoming apparent that they will often use geopolitical issues in order to try to bulldoze their way through domestic problems and issues. So I think maybe there will be a resumption, but it will be based on what was already mandated, what was already approved, because that won't require any additional funds, and he won't have to go to his base and say, well, we're chucking a load of new money at Ukraine. I think that's highly unlikely. So expect what was already expected. Hopefully that means that the ammunition famine, which is also threatened if those supplies don't resume, that will be averted for now. But there are other issues on the horizon, such as the Czech election coming up that could cause issues there. Will he supply new air defense units? Well, Ukraine's offered to pay for those. I think if we do see him going further than the sort of mandated supplies, then it will only be to sell munitions to Ukraine. But that's not a bad thing. If Europe's willing to pay for those, or to use the frozen Russian assets to pay for these air defense and ammunitions, 145mm, then that's good. I don't see Trump putting forward any new packages of assistance. I think it's what's been agreed, and then he may well be minded to sell some stuff to Ukraine.
Yeah, the other day I watched Paul Warburg on YouTube. He talked about it specifically. He said that basically Trump is trying to negotiate the best price for the weapons that Ukraine can't buy from him, which of course is wrong, because instead of sincerely helping Ukraine out of having a feeling of empathy and understanding of international law, Trump is trying to basically trade. Transactionalism is not really good at in this very situation. However, it's not like the best outcome that we could expect as Ukrainians, right? Because
it's not the worst either, is it? I mean,
yeah.
If Trump is only driven by incompetence and his transactional mindset, then that should have some internal logic which we can deal with. That is actually the least of our problems, ironically. It's if he's a full Russian agent or asset, as some have suggested. That's a far worse problem, because no amount of reasoning, no amount of bribery, no amount of transactional, behaviors or agreements would be able to cut through that or change that position. So I think we should hope that Trump is transactional, because that's our only silver lining at this point.
I guess so, and to me it looks like that at this point. Do you think that, let's step a bit, into this territory of tinfoil hats, do you believe there is a chance that he could be recruited?
Of course. I mean, knowing how the FSB work, that there's a very strong chance of that. And people will say, oh, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? I've spent time in Russia. I have friends who were approached by what we later concluded were KGB agents. I have friends who went further and they seriously would have tried to co-opt and recruit them. I take it as a personal slight that they never thought I was that kind of material. But they work on I mean, they find people who have issues. They find people not necessarily who are purely transactional. They find people who are malleable and potentially have issues. And then, I mean, you know you know how this works. It works. They don't immediately come in and threaten, because that doesn't work particularly well. Uh, it might work on dissidents, but they always come in with a carrot and a stick. And if they're trying to recruit foreign agents, it's all carrot. It's all carrot, 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 carrot until they need something back from you. So it's about giving you perks. It's about making your life easier. If you like girls, they get you girls. If you like booze, they get you booze. If you like drugs, they get you drugs. If you like really weird, perverted shit, they'll get you more weird, perverted shit than you can handle. And they also will psychologically manipulate you and coddle you and all sorts of stuff. I can see that Trump's personality is exactly the kind of complicated, broken kind of person that they go after. A person with money issues, but also an extreme desire for status and a hankering after wealth. This is exactly the kind of character that they would try to co-opt. The question then becomes whether he's an asset, an agent, or a useful idiot. I'm not sure it matters. I think we just need to look at his behavior and ask ourselves, is it to the benefit of the Kremlin? And if the answer is yes, then it doesn't really matter whether he's an asset or an agent or not. The fact is that he's working to the benefit of the Kremlin. Now, I've heard him called by one Russian analyst, they call him an unreliable asset. So I think people will point and say, well, he's done things that actually must have really pissed the Kremlin off. Well, yes, maybe. But of course, it's never going to be black and white. And you're not going to want your asset or agent to be so obvious. So the fact that he's maybe going off message quite a lot, I don't think worries them. They're looking at the big picture.
Yeah, absolutely. One of our friends there in the chat says that the deep web, not even the deep web, but the dark web actually is mostly run on Russian servers and software because it allows illegal things to be sold outside Russia on its platforms. That, by the way, include massive not sure how to call them, banks for converting and selling the cryptocurrency, which is, again, something very, very suspicious because Trump makes this environment that would let, for example, Russia or China invest in his business, his political activities and everything else without leaving any trace, because you cannot trace those transactions, which is crazy. I think in Ukraine that stuff would not work because people would be very, very mad, very mad.
People are always talking about, oh, have the Russians got compromat on him, as if that compromat could only be recorded when he's in Russia. But if you have some of the world's most expert hackers, you don't have to gather that evidence directly. It doesn't have to be your evidence. You can hack other systems where there is evidence of wrongdoing. So I think in this new age, a Russian compromat or the process of compromat has got vistas open to it that never could have been dreamed of under the Soviet Union. And that is that anything exists on the dark web, anything that exists on servers, including possibly even sort of government servers, that contains, information people might not want to get out, which could be used for blackmail. I mean, this is a golden age for this kind of Russian tactic, I would have thought.
It's kind of frightening, I would say, because again, the YouTube channel of Paul Warburg, there's a lot of interesting videos that you can find, and he talked about the threat of drones, for example, because nowadays the level of using drones for all sorts of malicious and nefarious activities is absolutely insane. They can be used to eliminate people, again, without leaving any trace. and using only AI, so they don't even need to be connected with other people, which means that I believe that it's only a matter of time when we will see terrorist organizations besides Russia, other terrorist organizations utilizing them, to reach their goals, which
Absolutely,
is
absolutely.
yeah, which is extremely frightening. I cannot find a different
It,
word.
it it doesn't even take radical new technologies to do that. I mean, the latest thing I've heard. I mean, you wouldn't have had to face this because I think you haven't been on the front since the sort of fly by wire and fiber optic really came in. But now they're talking about fiber optics which go up to 100 kilometers, which means that all logistics is well within range. Um, and they're also looking at fiber optic drones, which of course can't be jammed electronically and are much more difficult to track, which have solar cells. So it's like having sort of airborne IEDs. You can basically fly your drone into the target area. You can park it by the side of the road. It trickle charges, so it can be there forever unless it's discovered, and then you wait until the right vehicle comes along. Whereas go back a year or two, you'd have flown your drone in, um, manually, as it were. It's got a finite battery life. It's got a smaller payload. You get it into the target zone. It doesn't matter if there's a target there or not. You have to hit something because that drone's not coming back out again, and you've got a very small window of opportunity. Now those limitations, both geographically and indeed time span, are gone. And this is even manual. If you can start programming it with some form of autonomous behavior with solar cells and with these fiber optic, then yeah, this is a development of warfare which I'm not sure any of the Western allies are really geared up for. I mean, Ukraine is constantly innovating to battle these and develop its own kind of tech to gain the edge. I'm not sure Western militaries are really keeping up with the speed of development that's required.
Yeah, analyzing their readiness to facing, for example, a sudden Russian aggression. Um, if they cannot provide enough weapons to Ukraine, so Ukraine could be able to defend itself, for example, close its sky from Russian cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, drones, then I have doubt that basically at least European part of NATO is able to defend itself. Like all this time they were relying on the United States, and now we can see that the new administration is not really reliable, right? So it could raise
Yes,
these
that's
questions.
it. I mean, we're pushing Western Europe into investing 3.5% of GDP in sort of military platforms, which is great. But again, if you haven't got your research and development process sorted out, if you haven't refined your procurement systems, and if you're not testing everything in Ukraine, then unfortunately you're probably investing in a ton of stuff that could be almost instantly redundant. And I think there's some stuff I know is being tested and monitored in Ukraine. A lot of stuff isn't, and if it's not, then yeah, could just be a big old waste of money.
Yeah, I noticed one of your recent videos on your channel. You interviewed a former CIA agent. Actually, he didn't really
Yes.
worked with Russians. He worked with or like worked with doesn't mean that he worked for them, but we know the way he worked, right? He worked with Al Qaeda, like it was his area for responsibility, but he served during the Cold War, and actually he said a lot of interesting things in that interview. Guys, you might check it out. By the way, I think that you will like it.
It's
What were
called Glenn
your
Carl, and
yeah
he's absolutely fascinating man.
yeah? What were your biggest impressions from this interview?
I think one of the biggest impressions was the fact that he's sat in on interviews with Al Qaeda operatives. I mean, he sat in on, let's say it for what it is. He sat in on interviews, inverted commas, which were actually interviews with a degree of torture being involved. And one of the biggest things he said in the interview is that torture doesn't work. That kind of brutality doesn't work. It doesn't get good results, doesn't get good information either. It's just as likely to get false information under duress. What fascinated about that was his breadth. Here's someone who doesn't just read about sort of modern history and Cold War history, but goes back to, you know, centuries, if not thousands of years. It's someone who wants to get the full breadth. And it was his kind of understanding of, I think, the mechanics of the Russian regime and being able to place it into history, which I found absolutely sort of fascinating, actually, out of that one. And also, he's the only person, or one of the only people. There's some others in Lviv I was talking to at the Catholic University who we had an interesting conversation about it. I'm pretty convinced that Vladislav Surkov is still playing a significant role in Russia's shenanigans around the world, and in 2016, Trump and all the sort of manipulations we've seen since. I'm convinced that his ideas are still being injected into the Russian system. What surprised me is how few people, even who are pro-Ukraine, even many YouTubers running channels, had never heard of Surkov. And that seems to be absolutely fundamental to have an understanding of him and his role in helping to create Putin's regime. But Glenn Carl knew exactly who that was. In fact, he brought Surkov up. And I think he was curious to see if I'd heard of Surkov, but I instantly, it was like, yeah, we shared the same sort of thoughts and ideas there. So that's yeah, it's interesting talking to someone who's not a Russian area specialist, but who can place the extraordinary behaviors that don't make sense in a Western context, can actually place them in other contexts historically and actually make sense of them. And the other big idea, and this is one that we've talked about a lot, is the Russian power vertical, and people look at it as if the economic system emerges from the power vertical, whereas in fact it's quite the reverse. It's the same with the ideology. It's the same with Putinism, and Putin's sort of calling it an ideology is perhaps too much of a compliment. It's far less coherent than that. But it's people look at it as if that's the thing, and everything else flows from it. Whereas what it's all about is, and what it's always been about, is the control and flow of resources. The power vertical exists because you have an extractive economy. You have a Siloviki because not just to prop up the guys at the top of the pyramid, but because the entire business model requires you to be able to protect those assets that you're extracting and stealing. And the rest of the population are frankly superfluous to the business model that makes the majority of income for Russia. So what do? Well, you have to have a story. You have to have a compelling story that stops them from tearing the system down. And I think this is something he sort of understood and could articulate much better than me, and put it into a historical context in terms of other empires and the mechanics that have driven them.
I agree on that. And Surkov is basically like a dark cardinal, the dude behind the curtains. I would really, really like our friends there in the chat to check out your channel and check out this specific interview. Generally, Jonathan, what was the most interesting interview made like over the past month, for example?
Oh well, that was definitely one of them. I'm gonna have to look, because I do one a day, so I get quite confused. I think one of my favorite. I can tell you my favorite thumbnail were two that I've done in the last couple of days. I did one about the Russian politicians that are falling from meeting unfortunate accidents. So I called that one Windows Error. So I love the thumbnail on that one. And then I did one about Trump backing the wrong horse. But But in terms of actual interviews, I interviewed a very interesting Russian author called Elvira Barry. She's highly critical of Russian imperialism, and that was a pretty interesting conversation. We had Ben Hodges, of course, who came on and gave one of his sort of best interviews on the channel. We've got Georgi Ivanos of Ukraine Matters, always great value for money. I love his strength and his insights. I would have to say probably the most moving one was Alexander Matviechuk, the Nobel laureate, who is the most extraordinary, not just spokesperson for Ukraine, but for humanity and for the rule of law and for justice. And we discussed the concept that Ukrainians don't fit with standard media narratives. They're not the sort of perfect victims that you can, feel sorry for and hand your money over and then forget about. Ukrainians are far too they have far too much agency. They're far too difficult. They have opinions. They have opinions that aren't the same as ours sometimes. They don't see the West as perfect, and they're quite happy to critique us when that's required, which we don't like. So we did an episode there called "Imperfect Victims," and it's one of the reasons why I think the media and politicians have problems really keeping Ukraine in the headlines. It doesn't fit standard narrative structures of sort of victims.
Is it hard to interview General Ben Hodges? Because me, as a military, I have this reflex still that when you talk to generals, usually where I come from, usually generals ask questions, and you don't want to be present in the area anywhere. And when I interviewed General Ben Hodges, I had that kind of anxiety, what? Yeah,
Yes,
yeah, like what if he thinks that I'm like dumbass, which would be, of course, true, but still, is it hard to talk to people of that level?
it's not, and this is perhaps this is my perhaps extreme either lack of humility or disconnection from reality. I don't. How should I put this? I don't feel. I'll be polite with everyone, but I don't feel in a position of deference to anybody. Anybody. I will ask anybody anything if I think it's the right question, which is why this is why Boris Johnson almost certainly won't come on the channel. And it's why certain people who don't like us being asked impertinent questions won't come on. But no, it's my extreme lack of humility that I feel it's my right to be able to speak to anybody and ask them anything I want.
Yeah, that's a
So
good.
I don't get stage fright, as it were, with Ben Hodges or Petraeus. I mean, I have them on, and I do. I am nervous sometimes, and I have, I would say, a real sense of the respect and honor to be able to speak to them. So it's not a disrespectful thing, but I'm not awed by anybody.
Yeah, that's a good feature. Like when you're a journalist, for example, or making interviews with people, that's something that I would love to have myself. So, speaking of Russian oligarchs that mysteriously expire in Russia, we know that Starovoyt, ex-minister of transport in Russia, became better. Just like yesterday, right? he became better, and the reason it happened was because first he was responsible for the Kursk Oblast. We know that he was responsible for the defense of the Kursk Oblast, and when it failed, he was promoted to the Minister of Transport by Putin, and after the recent collapse, when there were plenty of Ukrainian good drones flying in the area, and Russians grounded all of their airplanes, not because they were afraid of drone strikes, because Ukraine doesn't do that, but because they were afraid of basically shooting down their own airplanes with their air defenses, which happens all the time. So in just 2 days, they lost more than $250 million because of all the delays, because of all the flight cancellations. And in 3 days, that sum was like double or something, as far as I remember. What the hell happened, in your opinion? Do you think that this is some kind of mafia-style spring cleaning? Or do you think that these deaths serve more like a strategic, I don't know, fear-based purpose inside Putin's regime? Because you literally don't see anything like that happening in any other country on earth.
From what I hear, you don't need really a huge number of drones in order to completely, cause this level of chaos. So this could well be something that now becomes a feature, which would be great. Unfortunately, it's playing on, I think, what Ukrainians really understand here, but the Westerners perhaps don't quite understand. We still think that many Russians are outraged by the war, even if they're not resisting, or the secretly, many find it appalling and reprehensible. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Many will just not think about it. It's not even that that they celebrate it, or they may well avoid the news programs that talk about it. They may just bury their heads in the sand and just want to forget about it. They may just not care at all. So what Ukraine's doing is smart. You don't have to terrorize Russians in order for them to start to think that the war is not such a good idea. All you have to do is inconvenience them, deprive them of what they think is their rights and their privileges, their right to travel wherever they want, their right to, do this and do that. If you start depriving them of what they consider to be their rights, which are in fact privileges, then you will start to kind of clamor for the end of the war, not out of any sense of morality, not out of any love of legality or humanity. No, just because they personally are starting to be inconvenienced by it. So the more that we can do to inconvenience them, the more we can do to shut them out of Europe and not grant them tourist visas, the more we can do to make their daily products more expensive, the more likely is that they will really start to en masse give feedback to their little father Tsar that they're not having fun anymore killing hochels, and this has to end because it's ruining their holidays.
I agree on that, because I read a lot of commentaries in the Russian communities where they were literally how to translate бомбить пердаком. Shooting fireballs out of their ears in the chat, because they couldn't fly to like Turkey, they couldn't fly to a resort in Hurghada, feed the tiger sharks, they couldn't even whine about it on their phone to their relatives, because when Ukrainian drones attack Russian objects, like Russian military plants and stuff like that, they usually shut down the mobile connection everywhere. So you don't have internet, you cannot call much, and everything just falls down in terms of communication. And this makes Russians very upset, which, by the way, I think is completely fair, because if airplanes don't fly in Ukraine, then why the fuck should they fly in Russia?
Why should they fly there? Yeah, exactly.
Let's be just. And another thing, that I wanted to ask you, what was No, let's talk about Ukraine just a bit later, because we still have another topic to discuss, which is beautiful China. That China
Oh
says
boy.
that it's extremely, extremely neutral in terms of its stance towards the war in Ukraine, and it says that it like doesn't support Russian aggression and things like that. But we know that this is not so, because like all Russian army is fighting nowadays using Chinese golf carts, Chinese drones, Chinese parts, and all sorts of Chinese stuff. How does China, in your opinion, benefit strategically from keeping terror Russia alive in this war? Is this more about weakening the West, right, through the long and draining conflict, or keeping like more or less isolated Russia, because it's not isolated enough, but keeping it as its, let's say, junior partner, or maybe there's something else to it.
I think there's definitely something else there. I don't think they worry about. I think they consider Russia to be a vassal state at this point. That's been quite clear from the body language when you've seen Putin talking to Xi. I think and there's a recent statement by the Chinese foreign minister who was in Europe that sort of attests to this. I think they see this as convenient. You know, we had thought earlier in the war that China would be embarrassed by its partner, that it's making so little progress, that it's so clearly incompetent. But actually, no. I think they're thinking of this as a strategic distraction. If Russia is engaging Western attention on the war, then the West is less prepared and less engaged about what is happening in the Asia Pacific region. We know that it's an ambition of theirs to eventually take Taiwan. So I think this really feeds into that. So unfortunately, they're playing a longer game. They're playing a very sneaky game here, which is that whatever weakens your adversary helps you. If in that process they can weaken Russia by fighting Ukraine and indirectly fighting the West, then all the better. You get to weaken one ally, which could also be an adversary in other circumstances, and you get to weaken your actual adversary, which is the Western powers. You also get to test their willingness to defend their values. You test their willingness to push back. You test their mettle, what they're prepared to do, what they're prepared to sacrifice for their values, and what they're not. And unfortunately, China must be looking at this and thinking that actually the West is in decline, is decadent, and is no longer able to put up a fight when it does make its move. This is my big concern here, which I did an episode on just today. This evening's episode was on China, and Mark Rutte's come out and said that there is a chance here that when China makes its move on Taiwan, that Russia will coordinate with that, and it will make its move on a NATO member state, not just testing in the kind of sub-threshold way we've talked about, so hybrid warfare, but a full incursion, a full invasion of a NATO member. That would completely distract. I'm sure that world leaders, if faced with two nuclear-armed states that are starting to gobble up other countries, that they will do everything to prevent that from becoming a nuclear third world war. And unfortunately, at that point, it's questionable as to whether we have the capability to immediately push Russia back, and how much. Where it depends where, of course, this incursion takes place, but whether we would actually have the will to retake whatever territories are taken, whether it's the Baltics, Romania, Moldova, whatever they decide to go for. Yeah, this is the real worry, and it may not be that far off. Their calculations almost certainly are that you have to make this move while Trump is in office, because his response is not. Yeah, it's far less likely that he will give a strong kinetic response to those invasions than a traditional, either Republican or Democrat president.
I agree on that. Do you think that China, before I ask this question, how much time do you have?
Oh, I've got a good. Well, we can keep going for a bit.
All right, all right. Do you think that China might be using Russia as, let's say, useful idiot, to test Western resilience, to test Western military unity, to understand how it works, to research this field?
Starsky, you call Ivan idiot? What you talking about?
Ivan is
This
not an idiot. Ivan is durak.
Ivan is Durak. He's not idiot. So let me go and tickle a salamander or something here and prove to you that I am not idiot after all. Um, yes, the answer is yes, of course. You know, does China want territory back that the Russian Empire stole? Of course it does. Will they take it militarily? That's questionable as to whether they'll ever do that. Will they be able to take it, de facto by having lots and lots of Chinese immigrants working those territories? Absolutely, that's already happening. Will they be able to take advantage of the potential disintegration of Russia? Yeah, absolutely, they would. Do they want Russia to disintegrate? At this point, probably not. Um, I think they're quite happy to see this bleeding edge in Europe continue. They're quite happy to see their Western adversaries put under extreme duress and pressure. They're quite happy for, in some ways, the chaos to continue under Trump, because that potentially drives European countries closer to China, not further away. Um, so, yeah, at this point, I think this is playing into Xi's hands. The big question, of course, is, as one of the comments says there, what is Xi's position? It may be that there are people in China who are not that happy at the direction Xi is taking, maybe not that happy at their national wealth being consumed with these big geopolitical games, and it may be perceived as too great a risk. But we don't know. I mean, I've spoken to a number of expert journalists who've corresponded from China for decades, and even they really say that the Chinese politics is far too opaque to come to any conclusion. So I know there are rumors there about Xi's position. I mean, the fact is we just don't know. Um, if his position is under threat, it could be even worse. He may use some kind of nationalist crisis, some kind of invasion of Taiwan to consolidate his hold on power and deal with, if there are indeed cliques sort of organizing against him. This is maybe exactly the crisis that he would use to bolster that. Let's not forget that the invasion of Crimea happened at Sorokov's suggestion, to shore up the Putin regime after Bolotna and increasing sort of, let's say, agitation by opposition forces, and ahead of an electoral process. 2022, Putin, I think, fervently believed this would be a short, victorious war, again, which would bolster his electoral chances and indeed allow him to strengthen his regime. Hasn't worked out that way, but I don't know if China's really learnt that lesson or not.
I guess. Roxy from Ukraine asks, isn't China going through a change of power? Do you know anything about that?
Well, this is what I just alluded to there, and no, it's far too opaque. We just don't know. There are rumors of it, but as I say, I've spoken to experts on China, and they say, look, there's really no way of knowing, and there aren't really any sort of concrete indicators about whether Xi is on the way out or whether he's even weakened. it's not possible to say with any certainty or even any uncertainty.
Yeah.
It's not clear at all.
China is so big and there's so many people inside, no one to ask, literally. Do you think, because again, from my level, I cannot judge much, and I'm not really concentrated on that part of the world, but generally, do you think the West is doing enough to pressure China for its indirect support for the Russia's war? And does the West do enough to deter China from invading Taiwan?
Absolutely not on both counts. No, we should be doing far more to discourage them and to explicitly make them pay an incredibly high price for their support of Russia and its war. We're not doing that. There is, of course, a sanctions package on the table, which has Lindsey Graham's name against it. Whether that gets implemented is highly questionable. It's well within the ability of Trump to implement that. And indeed, I don't think it would really represent any major problems for him. But will he? At this point, it's not looking. I don't think it's looking particularly likely that he'll adopt the extremely punitive sanctions program. But if he does, then that could have a significant impact. But it's there. I think a lot of Republicans would like that. They would like China to pay a price for supporting Russian aggression in Ukraine. I hope they do. Should we be doing more to block, their supply of components and stuff? Well, it's not just supply of components. I was speaking to, this interview hasn't gone live yet, but speaking to a technology expert, or they're actually a sort of venture capitalist in Ukraine, working with defense tech, and there are American components turning up. So 80% of the components in the Shaheeds and the missiles that are being shot down are now explicitly Chinese, but there are other chips in there, NVIDIA chips, Texas Instruments, other Western manufactured kit turning up in Russian munitions. So, we've got to do more to block that, as well as the revenues. Directly, Europe should not be paying for things like Russian hydrocarbons, but equally we should put pressure on China via secondary sanctions and India to, at the very least, observe the price caps, which of course should be driven down as well to $45 a barrel, and put a really high price for non-compliance.
I want to ask you this. Recently, Elon Musk stated that he's gonna start a new political party, the America Party. Do you think it's like something serious? Should we expect some of, for example, Republicans and conservatives who were dissatisfied or disappointed with Trump to join this movement, or it's generally another ketamine hallucination?
Yes, I was going to say, do I take the ketamine kids seriously? The answer is no. He is a South African billionaire. He's not American by birth. He has lost. He was hugely admired by many people, not just on the right, but since his involvement with Trump and the antics he's got up to, he's not particularly popular. And he'd already burned his bridges with those on the centre and the left, and now by falling out with Trump and insulting and attacking him, he's fallen out with those people on the right as well. I don't think he has any friends left. I wouldn't be surprised if at some point he turns up in Beijing or Moscow, trying to find some new friends. That seems to be the kind of trajectory he's on. But it does raise a question. If he is a Kremlin project of some sort, and he certainly has spouted Kremlin narratives repeatedly. Is it because he's been influenced, because he's susceptible to influence? Is it because there's a closer relationship there with Russia than he'd care to admit? If that's the case, this pensionat, this convalescence home of dictators might get a new resident. I would imagine, um, Bashar Assad. Certainly, Errol Musk will probably be joining them because he's already in Moscow spouting rubbish. This is going to be a very interesting kind of hotel dining room when they all kind of come together.
Yeah,
Christmas
yeah.
in Hotel Moscow,
With vodka, seletka, shuba and that stuff. She, of course. Yeah, Edward Snowden playing like accordion,
Edward Snowden on the accordion.
Steven Seagal with
right.
balalaika, something like that. That would be so cool. I think that stream would gather a lot of views on Twitter.
Julian Assange maybe doing a little kind of cheeky strip on stage to the accompaniment of Edward Snowden. Yeah, it's going to be weird.
I'd love that. Yeah, a lot of people don't know there that his father actually, who in his interview last month, I believe, said that he and his son Elon admire Putin because Putin is so smart when he speaks. He's such a good leader. So his father went to Moscow, where he participated in the conference dedicated to like technology and something else, but he also was invited by Dugin, Alexander Dugin, former member of the Black Order of SS in like 80s and 70s, and basically ideologist of Russian terrorism and imperialism. I think he could have been, asking like the Russian authorities about some kind of position, like, guys, do you need like a space guy maybe as a supplant for like Rogozin in the Roscosmos, things like that?
Yes, I think there's a role for that, except that first thing you should do is re-engineer all the windows to make sure they don't open. That's the first thing I check before taking that role up.
Oh yeah,
and
oh my God.
Elon Musk's rockets have a habit of blowing up. I think the penalty for losing too many rockets is kind of not good in Moscow. You don't really want that.
There's a different penalty, being sucked out of a window for knowing too much. That is a thing that we can observe a lot in Russia. Either suspicious tea or like suspicious 9mm piece of metal. Striking someone's head or things like that. And of course, the open windows, the gravity changes. I think probably Elon Musk might know a bit about it because it's such an interesting phenomenon when people walking next to an open window, all of a sudden gravity just like pushes them outside. And there's
a lot
of
backdrafts. It's. I was always being told by Russians, especially grandmothers, to be careful of skvoznyaki. This is drafts. Now I know. Now I know what they meant.
Oh my God. Okay, let's answer some of the questions. There's a question from Ivan. Do you think Putin can avoid mobilizing the middle class and elites? So far, he has relied on the poor, criminals, and foreigners. Would he have riots? In my opinion, he has a lot of Russian cannon fodder that he can still mobilize. And I think that they calculated the rate of mobilization to be able to replace losses. So they mobilize approximately enough to be able to replace monthly losses in Ukraine. And those losses can be anything between 40 and 60,000 Russian orcs fertilizing Ukrainian soil. I remember late 2024, they were mobilizing between 30 and 40,000 Russians on a monthly basis
Yeah,
because that was approximately their losses. And now, with the
yeah,
escalation of their attacks, their losses grew, of course. And another reason why Russians are facing such losses nowadays is because they don't have much armored vehicles to support their assaults. That's why they rely heavily on shit like donkeys. Well, they don't ride donkeys, of course,
yeah.
but they utilize golf carts. They utilize all sorts of civilian cars that are not really made to use in combat, and with that rate of losses, they still have enough of cannon fodder that they can
Yeah.
mobilize. I don't know, allure them with like high salaries, compensations, and things like that.
Well,
What
this
do
is the
you think
thing,
about it?
Yeah. I think they're going to run out of money before they run out of people. That's the interesting question here, because I think you're right. They can always find more bodies, at least for the next year or so. I don't think it's going to necessarily be a problem. But there's high salaries and there's a huge inflation in those military contracts. What they have to pay people to actually sign up, and of course the high casualty rate means they then have to pay out these sort of death bonuses and so on. Yeah, I'm not sure this particular way of populating their army is financially stable. So actually, I would say at some point it's not necessarily a question of whether they need to recruit the middle classes because they've run out of people. But if they run out of money, then they're going to have a stark choice, which is stop the war or start pushing people into the army through coercion and terror. That, I think, is the choice that is going to be facing Putin in the next 9 months.
That's plausible. Um, do you think it's possible they will run out of money, like their economy may collapse anytime soon? Do we have any indications of that?
Yes, I think they'll run out of money because they already are. Their budget deficit this year is already in excess of what remains of their so called sovereign wealth fund. As long as the Western countries do not hand back the frozen central Russian bank assets, that could be a significant, boost to Putin's war chest. But as long as that money is not handed back, and we continue to more or less, keep sanctions at this level, ideally increase them, then Putin is going to have some serious money problems. Will the economy instantly collapse? Well, unfortunately, not, because he still has the option to completely deviate from a market economy, to completely return to a centralized economy. Now, that's going to be disastrous for Russia in the long run because that will cause an extraordinary economic collapse. And it's not clear how they will recover from that. But it will allow him to prolong the war. I would say for a good few months, 6, 9, 12 months, simply by using brute force and terror to channel people in, to take businesses to. And we actually, this is an interesting thing. I'd love to have your thoughts on this. We focus on the unfortunate Russian ministers falling out of windows, but these guys, when they do steal, they're stealing in the millions. Right? That's not going to help Putin by taking their fortunes over. But many of the oligarchs are sitting on billions of assets, billions and billions. And we saw the first move against a loyal oligarch this week. I don't know, I can't remember his name, but he is a gold magnate. He has gold mines in Siberia, and he was prevented from leaving the country while on his private jet by the FSB. So, this, I think, is the logical route for Putin next. It's like when you run out of, good logs, you start throwing whatever is to hand onto the fire. And at this point, I think you're going to see the regime starting to consume its own. Um, they also will need to steal businesses off people to give to more loyal insiders. They're going to need to steal business to strip it of their assets to keep Putin's war going. So this is, I think, is the process for the remainder of the year you're going to see, which is more of these, call it expropriation. If anyone's familiar with the concept of war communism during the Russian Civil War, I think this is what it's going to start to be comparable to. They're going to be grabbing everything that they can burn up and consume to keep Putin's insanity going.
I agree on that. Do you know what беспредел means?
Yes, that's like lawlessness, isn't it?
Yeah, that's basically mayhem or something like that. That is a term coming from the Russian prison culture, which when you can do whatever you like, because according to the Russian prison culture, you even if you're like a crazy criminal, there's still set of rules
Still
that
some rules, yeah.
Yeah, you have to obey. Понятие, that's what they call it.
Yep.
And беспредел is something that Russian criminals don't respect. But I think that we already seen a lot of беспредел committed by Putin against other subordinates, right? Because this is like this very, very interesting mix of Russian prison culture, Russian criminal culture, and KGB culture that you mentioned in that interview with Glenn. That is 100% accurate, description of what we can observe in Russia. People there
that's it. I mean, this concept of vory v zakonie, thieves in law. There's a concept there, as you say, that there's a level of thievery and criminality which is not only permitted but is actually built into the system, tolerated so that the system can function, used by the regime to uphold its power and authority. I think what you're starting to see here, and it's a great word you bring up there, you're starting to see Putin break not the social contract, because there isn't really a social contract. He's starting to break the criminal contract that he has with other criminals in the system. They're starting to think, hang on a second, we've been loyal to this guy, but now nobody is safe.
Absolutely. And this is good. This is good. People, oh my God, people are starting congratulating me with the birthday.
Is it your birthday? Is it your birthday?
Yeah. Oh my God.
Oh, happy birthday.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you, my dear friends and family in the chat. I appreciate it so much, even though I don't celebrate much. Do you know that crazy Slavic superstition not to celebrate your 40th birthday? Did you encounter that?
No, I haven't heard that one. Although when I turned 40, I did nearly have a nervous breakdown, a midlife crisis, but a good holiday kind of fixed that. But it's an age where you kind of do tend to look at things and go like, hang on a second, what have I done? I mean, in your case, you think you've done a tremendous amount. Surely you can't look back and feel that you haven't achieved an extraordinary amount.
I don't know. I doubt that. But still, come on, 40 years. It's basically like 25. Only you don't have hair anymore. What I wanted to ask you, there was a very, very good question from our old member on this channel, by the way. Jonathan, would you feel the same if you were, it's a commentary regarding you having absolutely no remorse towards the people you interview. Jonathan, would you feel the same if you were interviewing someone in your field like Dan Rather?
Well, this is a curious, and I can see why this person said that, but he's not in my field. I'm not trained as a journalist. I use some techniques that could be recognized as journalistic techniques, but I'm not a journalist. So no, I don't particularly would feel any different. In fact, in some ways, when I this is the irony, when I interview technologists, I feel a little bit of that because my industry is actually marketing technology. So I feel a little bit of an awe when I'm in company of technologists, and I've started doing some interviews on a separate channel about AI. And curiously, I there I do actually have a little bit of imposter syndrome because I'm like, I really do feel that their knowledge is vastly superior to mine on this subject. No, I'm not a journalist, and yeah, that doesn't hold. The one interview where it did feel very very odd. I mean, speaking of Kasparov, of course, was curious when you have Kasparov on the end of it. It's that's a moment of extreme dissonance. Like he's he's in my house. Here he is, not physically, but he's on the screen, and that's kind of weird. Bill Brower's another one because and Fiona Hill because they have very large public profiles that go way beyond this specialist field. The weirdest one though has to be Alexander Nevzorov because I mean, people may not know who he is listening in, but he was one of the biggest, if not the biggest, so-called journalists during the sort of Glasnost period. He was huge, in the Russian-speaking world, and he's an extraordinary personality. He's very flamboyant. He's got certain characteristics that make him very, I would say, difficult in some ways. As they say in English, he doesn't really suffer fools, and that's quite intimidating. And when I was a student, sitting in my little communal apartment in St. Petersburg, and an absolute nobody, there he was on the television, and it obviously took quite a dark. He calls it a sort of soft Nazi period, soft fascism. And he had a period of extreme darkness, which he actually talks about. But that was weird, that was weird having that person know your name and address you. But that's the only time it's felt really, super odd. I'm guessing if I did, interview Boris Johnson, I might feel that's another extremely odd moment. Or Zelensky, if he's listening, hi, Volodymyr, I'm up for it. I mean, that would be odd as well. But apart from that, it's become what I do day in, day out. And I never lose the reverence for the guests, but I'm not in awe of them. And that's, I mean, how should I say, especially journalists? That doesn't sound quite right, but yeah, I mean, there are a couple I especially respect, like Edward Lucas and Luke Harding. And it's kind of quite odd now that when I go to events and, they recognise me and we have a good chat. I mean, that's a slightly weird thing. It's 3 years ago, no one knew who the hell I was. No, nobody whatsoever. And so that's slightly weird. But it's only weird when you interact with people in the physical world. When I do this every day, it's just me and a screen, and I'm having a nice chat with people in my own home. So I try not to sort of turn it into a sort of big thing in my mind.
Absolutely. I would be nervous, for example, interviewing commander of the National Guard. Yeah, 100%, because that's where my all reflexes and stuff come from. President Zelensky, probably not that nervous if I could, because guys, I remember President Zelensky on a TV, all sorts of stand-up comedies, and generally yes, that's why all Ukrainians percept President Zelensky not like that like dictator, like leader, like boss. Yeah. We percept him like our guy from the TV, that's like most of Ukrainians share. To us, he's like our guy from the TV, like the guy who was like who plays Russian Empire the way he played piano back then. So that is why
but that's nice. That's nice.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, and generally, as Ukrainians, we don't really recognize authorities at all.
Yeah.
Ivan asks, "Oh my God, Ivan, I've lost your commentary. Like, where?" So the question was, if you are 40, what happened to your hair? I served in the army for like a quarter of my life. I hope that answers your question, my friend. Whom would you like to interview besides President Zelensky and besides Boris Johnson? I would really like to see that interview with Boris Johnson, by the way.
That it'll probably never happen, but it would be lots of fun for sure. Who is there? There's not that many people on my list who I haven't either got to interview or whom it would be a particular issue anymore. Yeah, I mean, I'd like to. Kaja Kallas would be interesting to speak to. The former Prime Minister of Finland would be fantastic. Marin, really top of my list, which are very difficult to get, are people like Sergei Plakhy and Timothy Schneider. They're extremely difficult to sort of pin down and get to come on. I mean, that people aren't going to find that maybe that interesting, but as I say, some of these top sort of academics and historians are top of my hit list rather than bigger celebrity speakers.
And finally, let's talk about your experience in Ukraine. I know that you probably feel tired already, but
Interview
I hope
which? Vidma. Who am I going to interview? Who's which? Just seeing this comment pop up.
Vidma, yeah, that is Ukrainian sniper. That
Okay.
is, yeah,
Yes, I know.
she was on
Yeah.
YouTube, but you probably saw her.
Yeah.
President Peter
She'd be
Pavel.
good.
President Peter Pavel.
Peter Pavel, that'd be good. Now, I'd love to interview him with a large Czech beer, one of those nice brown ones with a foamy head on. That would be excellent. Yes, I'd be up for that.
Oh my
And
God.
Budanov, General Budanov, that would be pretty insane. And Zaluzhny, again, if you're listening, Valery, General, he's very high on my list. By all accounts, his English isn't necessarily up to a conversation like this, so it would have to be in Ukrainian, which I don't speak yet, so it'd have to be through an intermediary. But yeah, these guys are all in my top 10 dream list.
I literally have not here though. I literally have like a tiny award from General Zaluzhny. I received it like 2022, I think, like a tiny, but it's just so cool to have it. Oh my God.
That is cool.
Yeah, I can literally, I don't know, hang it somewhere. So, all right. Question to you. What were your biggest impressions from your trip to Ukraine?
Which trip?
The recent one.
So, yeah, I'm going to have to say Lviv's fantastic. Kiev, I've only been once, and I thought it was stunning. I had a couple of days there, but I stayed in the Hotel Ukraina. The air defense, very loud. If you're, facing Maidan, it's probably not the best place to get, a good night's sleep. But if you want a dramatic view, then that's certainly. But we stayed in Padil, and I think the impression was just of just the sheer beauty of it and the life, the amount of fabulous food really makes an impression. So yeah, I just thought it was, yeah, what a brilliant place. I can imagine retiring there, although that hill in winter is probably, you won't want to be stuck at the top of the hill or sliding down it when it's been snowing. Of course, Odessa is fascinating, and yeah, I mean that's a glorious place. I didn't know what to expect, but it's got so much character, so much sort of life to it, and it's so appalling that it's being, battered every day.
Where exactly in Ukraine did you try the tastiest food during your trip? And what sort of food was that?
So there is. So a friend took us to a place near Bucha, a sort of suburb of Kiev, and it is a sort of ethnographic museum. So one week we got a tour, and it's lots of it's sort of little country houses, little cottages rebuilt from every region of Ukraine. All in different styles, and the interior different, and the decorations and the wooden furniture. Everything's sort of different depending on the region and the character of that region. But they've got a restaurant next to it, which recreates all these historic recipes and has you know lots of different types of midovucha and lots of weird sort of vodkas and so on. Yeah, the food was the best there, definitely. But also there was this fantastic restaurant in Kiev, which is designed to look like some sort of medieval um, peasant's palace or something. An extraordinary building, which does lots of sort of shashliky and meats and salads and so on. And that was a we'd helped out with a campaign to raise funds for the 69th Sniffing Brigade, and this was all their drivers and fundraisers were being thanked, and they had a big meal at this fantastic restaurant. So not only was it a brilliant venue, you also had lots of amazing people. So I met Roman Trachamets the first time there, and you had Rick. Rick the Ukrainian was there, Greg Terry, and his friend Zhenya, who sort of is his support in all his operations here. And there was Jonathan Pierce, and a bunch of other fabulous people. So I think that's the thing with Ukraine. It's fabulous food combined with fabulous people.
Absolutely. And right now I'm showing our dear friends the pictures from that very, very, very place that you have visited. It's a pyrohiv. It's like I would not call it small, of course. So generally,
it's grand. It's like a palace of food.
yeah, so it's like an ethnographic museum of Ukrainian architecture that combines a lot of different tiny villages that completely look like the villages where Ukrainians used to live, like in 18th century, 17th century. And the coolest thing about it is that there is like a bunch of Ukrainian regions with all their culture and all of their traditions are represented. And unfortunately, Russians hit that museum several weeks ago. Hopefully, not a lot of things were destroyed. But generally, it's like there's a village of like Polisia, right? A region of Ukraine called Polisia. And you walk through this village, you can see like the buildings, you can walk inside, you can see how the people lived there. And then there's a bunch of arrows showing like direction. And for example, that way, Chernihiv, all right? And you walk with your legs, you walk to the Chernihiv, and you can see the typical village of Chernihivshina. And then you can walk to the village of Zakarpattia. And what's interesting about it is that there's also different landscape. So, for example, if it's Polisia, then there's like a lot of forests. If it's like Mykolaievshina, then it's like open fields and stuff. If it's, for example, Zakarpattia, the Western Ukraine, then there's hills, there's pine trees, all that stuff. And the buildings, of course, look very different. But the coolest thing about it is Korchma, that is basically Ukrainian tavern. We have a bunch of them there in that area, and I remember there's this huge place with the tavern and also a bunch of like kiosks where you can buy like shashlik, you can buy all sorts of stuff, you can buy all sorts of like meat, cider, beer, and other things that are again very very typical. And there is a big field of buckwheat growing on it, the windmill horses and stuff. And when I was 18, no, sorry, when I was 19, when I was celebrating my 19th birthday, I got so much wasted there. I went with my friends to this place, and the friends are like, dude, let's go to Korchma, to the tavern. And we went to the tavern, and I remember I woke up in the field of buckwheat, the buckwheat growing with those yellow flowers, and I'm waking up late in the evening. I've no idea where I am. I can see like a windmill and a horse. And I'm like, oh, this is such a cool way to celebrate a birthday. Literally, guys, if you visit Ukraine next time, just go there and spend a day or like 2 days literally wandering around that place.
It's fantastic, and there's one in Lviv as well. A sort of I think it's a bit newer, but it's an ethnographic museum. It's spread out over a lot bigger territory, and it's set in a beautiful park with hills and a greater range of buildings. But that was constructed during the full scale war. I mean, this is just mind blowing that this wonderful world class museum of architecture and ethnography can be built during a full scale assault on the country. It's hugely inspiring.
Yeah, absolutely. With that, my dear friends, I think we can wrap it up just a bit. Maybe there is something you would like to say to our viewers.
There is. I'm going to do a little plug here because I know it's late, but I've just put a video live. And, sometimes these, when I record videos at events, live events, they don't do quite so well because, the algorithms don't quite like them. It's sometimes more difficult for people to hear what's being said. And, it just doesn't work so well. But I strongly, strongly recommend people to watch today's video and tomorrow's, which were both recorded in Lviv, because what my friend Irina has been able to do is to get absolute world-class Ukrainian experts there. We've got one panel on economics that's coming tomorrow, where we talk about the frozen Russian assets. Today's panel was today's the one I published today, even though it was recorded in May, is on military topics, military tech, innovation, but also a lot of stuff of what's happening on the front and how the technological revolution is being integrated with certain battalions, including the Unmanned Forces Battalion. There is information there you will not get anywhere else. There is insight in there you will not get anywhere else. So check that video out. I think people will find it worthwhile.
Absolutely, my friend. Dear friends, please subscribe to Silicon Curtain if you haven't done it yet. I believe that already like half of my friends are your friends as well. So
we should have a lot of friends in common.
Absolutely. I think good guys gotta stick together anyways. So, my dear friends, thank you so much for watching us tonight. Thank you so much for your congratulations, your beautiful words there in the chat. I appreciate it very, very much. Tomorrow I will have sushi, I'll promise. And my lady promised me, actually. And also, big thanks to all the moderators helping us and providing their security guarantees tonight in the chat. Big thanks to all the members of this channel who help to keep this channel running. And also big thanks to everyone who supports Ukraine. This is the right cause, this is the just cause, and this is the proper thing to do. Big thanks also to you, Jonathan, for joining us today. I've had enormously huge pleasure to hear your thoughts, as always. Always a pleasure to have you here, and a privilege. And as always, my dear friends, be safe. See you tomorrow. Most probably I will have like a tiny birthday stream. We will see. I don't guarantee, but we will see. Thank you so much.
You should definitely have a party online. You'll have a lot of fans, congratulating you if you do.
I feel blessed that I have a lot of friends around the world now, but today we have a sad anniversary, unfortunately, because exactly 1 year ago Russians hit the children's hospital in Okhmadit in Kiev, and we have kind of mourning day tomorrow, so I don't feel very much like celebrating, but nonetheless, I will celebrate only because I'm blessed to have such a great community of friends and family that are in the chat, you, Jonathan, and all other people supporting my country. Thank you very much, and as always, be safe. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.